Hi, everyone. This is our first lecture in microbiology, and it's going to be split into three sections. This will be split into Introduction to Microbiology, Microscopy, and Staining. And in this lecture, we are going to briefly state what microbiology is. You're going to learn about microscopy and staining in this lesson that's been composed of three different sections. So by the end of this whole lesson, you'll be able to explain the methods used to study microbes, to understand what microbes are, to understand a little bit about microscopes and the types of microscopes there are, and to understand cell staining. Now, in microbiology, microscopy and staining are very important because they help us diagnose a lot of infections. For example, if someone has a urinary tract infection, you would want to know what microbe is in their urine. So you might look at it under the microscope. You might also stain the urine and then look at it under the microscope. So our first section in this lesson, section A, is going to talk about what microbiology is. At the end of this microbiology section, you'll understand what microbiology is. You'll understand different groups of microbes or microorganisms, and you'll also learn how we name microbes, which we call binomial nomenclature. Okay, to start off with microbes and what they are and why we care about microbes. Microbes or microorganisms are very, very small organisms that we cannot see with our eyes alone. So we all know this, you cannot see bacteria or viruses with your eyes. So we call them microbes. Micro means small. And just a little brief background on microbes. Microbes are everywhere. They're everywhere from the ocean to they've been discovered on different planets, to our skin, on surfaces. Microbes are just everywhere. And when most people hear the word microbe, they think all microbes are bad. And we call bad microbes pathogenic. I'd like you all to know the word pathogenic or pathogen. This means something that causes disease. But in reality, there are a few pathogens, and a lot of microbes are actually good for us. So, besides bad microbes, which we will learn about in the course and infection, besides pathogens, some things that microbes do is microbes help with ocean. So, a lot of microbes are able to do photosynthesis in the ocean, and they are the basis of the food chain in the ocean that support all marine life. There's soil microbes that play a role in the decomposition of organic matter so that they can recycle nutrients back into our ecosystem. In food production, microbes are so important for making things like yogurt, cheese, vinegar, and bread. Also, as another idea, certain microbes in like bacteria in our intestines help in digestion, and they make different essential nutrients for us, like vitamin K and vitamin B12. To give you some background, vitamin K is important for blood clotting and our bone health, and it helps prevent too much bleeding by regulating our body's clotting process. Vitamin B12 is important for the production of red blood cells and to maintain a healthy nervous system. So they make different vitamins for us. They can be decomposers. They can break down oils in basically the environment. And then this picture of insulin, the reason I put it here is microbes are also used in a lot of biotechnology. And actually the medication insulin that people with diabetes take is produced in bacteria. And we'll learn about it later. So what I want you to take from this slide is microbes are everywhere. Even though a lot of us think as microbes as things that make us sick, which we call pathogens, there's a lot of good microbes in the world. Okay, so types of microbes. So what are types of microbes that we can think of? So microorganisms, which are also called microbes, are very diverse and they're different than one another. And what I would like you to get from this slide is that bacteria and viruses and archaea and fungus and protozoa are different things. I'll just use two examples. So bacteria and viruses are both microbes, but they're very different than each other. So what I'd like you to know is there's different types of microbes, microorganisms. There's bacteria, there's archaea, there's fungus, there's protozoa, there's algae, and there's viruses. And throughout the course, we'll learn about these. I'm just going to give you a brief overview about them right now. Okay, starting with bacteria. Bacteria is a microbe, and bacteria is what we call a prokaryote, meaning it's made up of prokaryotic cells. Later, we will learn about cells, but there are two types of cells in the world. There's prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And at this level, all I want you to know is prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. We'll talk about what that is later. So bacteria are prokaryotes, also called prokaryotic cells because they don't have a nucleus. They're single-celled organisms, meaning that they're made up of one cell. And there's so many different types of bacteria in the world. I'm sure you've heard of so many different ones, but just to give you an idea, there's a lot of beneficial bacteria, like the good bacteria in our gut and our intestine that helps with digestion, that helps with, there's bacteria that we use in food production, like to make yogurt and other foods, bacteria for nitrogen fixation in the oceans, in the soil, and then bacteria for decomposition. And then, as we all know, there's bacteria that can make us sick or cause disease. So we call them pathogens. So there's also a group of pathogenic bacteria. Next type of microbe, which you may have not heard of because it's not very common, is archaea. Archaea are also prokaryotes. They're made up of prokaryotic cells. They're microbes, and we used to think of archaea as microbes that just inhabit extreme environments. While a lot of them often inhabit extreme environments, research is showing that they are like bacteria and we can see them in a lot of other places. But in general, archaea inhabit extreme environments, meaning extreme environments where other organisms wouldn't live. So we see archaea that live in very, very salty environments. We call those extreme halophiles. Halo means salt. Phile means loving. So there's archaea that live in environments like salt lakes where there's a high salt concentration. There's archaea that can live in very high heat places like hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean where it's extremely hot. And then there's archaea that are methanogens, meaning they produce methane. When they do their metabolism, they produce methane like in the intestines of animals and other things. So all I want you to get from this slide is another type of microbe is archaea. They're prokaryotes and they usually live in extreme environments. Next, we have a microbe called fungi or fungus. A lot of us have heard of this. Fungus, different than bacteria and archaea, fungus are eukaryotic, meaning they're made up of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. We'll talk about that in the cell lecture later. So fungus are eukaryotic cells, and two popular groups of fungus, or three actually, is yeasts, molds, and mushrooms. Yeasts are unicellular, meaning they're made up of one cell. To give you an idea, there's good yeast, like the yeast we use in baking, and there's pathogenic disease-causing yeast, like the yeast species that cause vaginal yeast infections. And then there's molds and mushrooms. So mold, we've all seen mold on food, but there's a lot of different types of strains of mold. There's a lot of pathogenic molds as well that cause lung infections. And then mushrooms, even though we all can see mushrooms with our eyes, they do have a microscopic life cycle, meaning at the beginning of their life, there is a microscopic phase. And by the way, just to mention, with these slides, you'll hear me a lot say there's good and then there's pathogenic. When I say that there's good bacteria and bad bacteria, or good fungus and bad fungus, I'm talking different strains. So for example, the strain of yeast that we use for baking is not the same strain of yeast that causes vaginal yeast infections. Another group of microbe is called protozoa. So protozoa are eukaryotic. They're made up of eukaryotic cells, meaning they have a nucleus. They're made up of single cells, and some of them are normal, meaning they're fine, they're free living, they live in the ocean. And then there are protozoa that are pathogens. And again, the word pathogen means that they cause disease. An example of a protozoa that is a pathogen is one called Plasmodium, which we will learn about in class. If you have heard of malaria, malaria is a disease that affects people worldwide. It's a disease that affects red blood cells and over time causes malaria and a lot of other medical issues. That is caused by a protozoa. A lot of times people think malaria is caused by bacteria or a virus. That is not true. It's caused by protozoa, and actually, it's caused by protozoa in a mosquito. So, if a mosquito has the protozoa species and it goes on and stings you, then you will get malaria. So, it's transmitted by mosquitoes. And then finally, there's one more microbe I want to talk about almost finally. A microbe is algae. So I know there's algae that we can all see with our eyes in the ocean, but before it becomes like this, it has a microscopic life cycle. And if you get an ocean water sample and you look at it under the microscope, you will see some algae. They're found in freshwater, saltwater, and soil samples. They do photosynthesis, which is very important for oxygen production. As you know, we need oxygen to survive, so do other organisms. Okay, and the final microbe I wanted to talk about is viruses, which we've all heard of viruses. We call viruses microbes or infectious agents. Viruses are not prokaryotic or eukaryotic cells because viruses are not alive. We will learn all about viruses later. I am aware that they've caused a pandemic and they're very dangerous, and it sounds weird to say that they're not living, but they really are not living. The reason why viruses can be so detrimental and devastating, we've all heard about of coronaviruses, the flu virus, so many other viruses, is that when they can infect a living cell, like a human cell or an animal cell, and once they're in touch with a living cell, they are able to make copies of themselves. But on their own, they're not living. We say they're acellular. Anytime you put the prefix a before a word, it means not, means they're not cellular, they're not living, they cannot do their own metabolism, they cannot make their own energy. And all viruses are, which we'll learn about later in this semester, is a little bit of genetic material, DNA or RNA, that is surrounded by a protein coat. That's all a virus is. So at this level in the course, all I want you to know is that they're not eukaryotic and they're not prokaryotic because these terms refer to cells, and viruses are not made up of cells because they are not alive. Okay, next we're going to go into the classification of microbes. So, you know what? I wouldn't even say classification of microbes. I would say classification of life if I were to make this bigger. So, all life can be split into three groups, and we call those the three domains of life. So, we can put a spider in one of these domains of life. We can put humans. We can put bacteria. So microbes are classified into the three domains of life, and the three domains of life are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotic, meaning that they're made up of prokaryotic cells, meaning they don't have a nucleus. They are both single-celled organisms. Domain eukarya includes all organisms that do have a nucleus, meaning they're eukaryotic cells. Some organisms in domain eukarya are unicellular and some are multicellular. Now, the way that I tell students to memorize this, like if I tell you what's a flower, what's a human, are they part of domain bacteria, domain archaea, or domain eukarya, is bacteria is in domain bacteria always. Archaea is in domain archaea always. And everything else is domain eukarya. That's the easiest way to memorize it. So if I told you what's a mold, domain eukarya. What's bacteria? Domain bacteria. What's a human? Domain eukarya. And then finally, if I were to ask you what domain of life do viruses fall in? None, because viruses are not living. And I love asking this question on tests. Okay, then we get into naming microbes. So scientific naming or naming microbes is called binomial nomenclature, and it's a standard way of naming organisms. Each organism is given two names. We call them the genus and the species. The genus is always capitalized and the species name is always lowercase, and both are italicized or underlined when you write them down. So for example, there's a bacteria called Escherichia coli. Escherichia is the genus because it's the first word. Coli is the species. And the reason why the system is used in the scientific world is because it's used worldwide. It allows scientists and healthcare professionals to communicate clearly about specific organisms. And I'll give you a good example. So if I were to say the word human, human is a word in English. I can ask someone who speaks Spanish or someone who speaks French or someone who speaks any other language, how do you say human? And everyone would tell me a different word. But the scientific word for human is Homo sapien. If you say the word Homo sapien to a scientist in America or a scientist in India or a scientist in China, we will all know that that refers to human. So that's what we mean by saying the naming system is used worldwide when people write scientific papers. E. coli is E. coli anywhere you go. And by the way, when I say E. coli, I mean Escherichia coli. And if I were to give you any organism and I tell you what's the genus and what's the species, the first word is always the genus, and the second word is always the species. So just about the format, I really want to emphasize this again. This is so important in class for everyone to know. Again, when we look at an organism in binomial nomenclature, it has two names. So there's a bacterium called Staphylococcus aureus. A lot of times this is what people are referring to when they say I have a staph skin infection or something like that. So if I were to give you this word and I were to tell you what's the genus, genus is always the first word, so it's Staphylococcus. What's the species, aureus, and what is the format that you write this in? Genus is capitalized and then everything else is lowercase. If you're typing the name of an organism, you italicize it. If you're writing it down, you underline it. And that is our end of section 8, Introduction to Microbiology. In the next section, you will learn about microscopes.